All right, everyone. So we've been talking about CSS for a while now. And CSS, I mentioned this way back how, there are versions of HTML, kind of like how there are versions of Microsoft Word or versions of Adobe Photoshop. And so we're currently using HTML5. There's actually versions of CSS. Everything I've been teaching you guys, well, I take that back. A lot of, the current version of CSS is CSS3. Um, the last major update was in 1999, and the new version CSS3 was made to kind of um, incorporate a lot of more visual stuff that wasn't available. So this included things like opacity, new things with fonts, and one of the new things we can do now is transform and also animation. Okay. So what is the CSS transform property? Well, let's go to exercise 2. And I have this page here. And this is how it previews. Okay. What the transform property can do is we can actually use CSS to change content after it's been loaded by the browser. So in other words, like, this is an H2, it's loaded by the browser, and it looks like this. This is an H3, it's loaded by the browser, and it looks like this. This is this image here, it's loaded by the browser. But what I can actually do is use CSS that gets applied after this HTML is loaded to change it around, okay? So one of this transform properties, one of the things we can do is something called translate. What translate allows me to do is to move an object in the horizontal direction or the x-axis and the vertical direction or the y-axis. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the H2 and I'm going to apply the transform property. And then we're going to apply translate. Okay. And what I'm going to do is here's the way it works. And the way you should think of it is I'm applying it to this H1. And so it's starting here. And then if I go to the right, I'm increasing the X value. And if I go down, I'm increasing the Y value. Okay. If I was using a negative X, it actually would be going to the left over here. And if I used a negative Y, it would actually come up here. So what I'm going to do is let's just do 100, 100. Okay. Do I use a comma? I think I use a comma. Yes, I do use a comma. So what this means is after the H2 has already been loaded in whatever order based on normal flow, we remember how normal flow works in that, it loads everything top down, left to right. This will then get applied afterwards. So what I'm saying here is after H2 has been loaded, move it 100 pixels to the right and then 100 pixels down. So if I save and I refresh here, you can see that it moves it. Okay. Let's try doing this to the image. I'll take this image, transform, translate. And if I were to just put, let's say I were to do just one value, like 300. If you just put one value, it would actually just do it in the horizontal direction, I believe. So see how it's moving the image, okay? Now keep in mind that so you can see here everything's moved. Let's say I wanted to move that H3, transform, translate. This time maybe I'll use a negative Y value. So let's use negative 50 pixels 0. what I'm doing here is I'm saying take the H3, move it 50 pixels to the left, and then it's not going to move anything in terms of the Y value. See how it's kind of like pushing it off the page a little bit. If I were to use a negative value here, this would actually move it up. And actually, you can see I'm getting this where it's actually overlapping with my original content. So we can use this if we want to move things around, even after they've been loaded based on their, based on the normal flow. It's a little bit kind of like CSS position, okay? Now, that's not the only thing we can do with transform. So we can translate, which means to move it based on an XY value, how much. And we can also rotate something, okay? Oops. All right, so I got 3 photos here. Now, normally, if let's just say for the sake of argument, I wanted to rotate this picture of a dog to its side. In other words, I have a picture and it's showing like this, and I really want it to show like that, right? The only way I could really do that would be to take it into, say, Photopea or Photoshop and then edit it by, and then save it, and then that would change this value. We can actually do this with all CSS. We don't have to take it into any other program if we don't want to. So what I'm going to do is I have this dog here, this picture of a dog. What I'm going to do is let's select that dog, and we're going to use transform, and we're going to use rotate. Okay. You look at my slides here. So the way rotate works is you can give it how much rotation to rotate the item. Okay. So if I have a photo, the way it works is it's like a clock. 0 is here, 90 is here, 180 is down here, 270 is here. So if you rotate it to 0, it basically keeps it right side up. If I rotated 90, I'm rotating it a quarter turn. If I rotate it 180, that's a half turn. If I rotate it 270, that's a 3/4 turn. Okay. So if I come in here and I say, let's do 90 DEG. There you go. Okay, I rotated that dog. Maybe I'll take the dancing banana, which has an ID of dancing, and I can rotate it 45 degrees, meaning it'll be on its side. Okay. Or I could flip it all the way upside down. That would be like rotate. Let's do 180. There you go. Okay. So all of this is, I'm able to manipulate my content without even having to take it to another program, which is kind of nice. Another thing we could do is called scaling. Okay. Scaling, I can scale something larger or smaller from whatever its normal size is. So, we've used CSS width and height to change perspective, but we can also use scale. This even works on things that normally don't have dimensions. Like, when we use width and height, that was usually on something like a video or an image. We could apply scale to like text or something. So I'm going to come in, this is exercise 4. And basically the same as the last one. There you go. What I'm going to do is I can say, okay, let's take the dog. I'm just selecting the dog using, using an ID and transform, and we're going to use scale. So if I wanted to make the image twice its normal size, I could say 2, 2. So the way that this works in terms of the syntax is that you got to think of 1 like 100%, and 2 is 200%, and 3 is 300%. This is the X or the horizontal percentage, and this is the vertical percentage. So if I say a scale of 200% horizontal, 200% vertical, what I'm really saying is like, let's stretch it out in terms of making it 200% the total size. So if I were to do this, and my image becomes twice its normal size. If I made it less than 1, like say 0.5 or 0.775, this would actually shrink it to be about half of its default size, whatever that is. Okay. So what's nice about this is it's also kind of relative. It doesn't matter what size the image is. You can just make it bigger or smaller. You can also scale things so that the width and height are not necessarily kept in ratio to each other. So when I do, if I were to scale it to 2, what that's going to do is take the image, scale it twice its normal size for both the horizontal and the vertical. Now let's just say for the sake of argument, I wanted the width to be a lot wider, but not the height. I could do something like this. In this case, the width is going to be 3 times its normal size, and the height is staying its normal percentage. The result of that is going to be that it's kind of stretched out. Maybe I'll do that to the dog here, where if I were to take this and make it, say, 3 times its normal size, see how it stretches out the picture of the dog? Okay. If you are going to keep things the same, you can actually just give it one value. So if I were to say, take this picture of a cat, let's just say I wanted to be twice the normal size. I don't actually have to do both the horizontal and vertical percentage. I could just say something like cat transform scale 2, and that would actually, this would automatically apply both for the horizontal percentage and, oops, did I go the wrong one? There. So if I go back, you can see how it does both. So that's interesting, right? This is all stuff we can do with CSS. We don't have to take it to Photoshop or any other program. So this kind of brings us to a major topic, which is something called a transition. Okay. So I'm just going to show you guys a couple of websites real quick. So we've talked about the idea of a hover effect, right? Where if you put your cursor above something, it can change its color or change its visual style. So here on Amazon, it's like, if I put my cursor above one of these hyperlinks, the hover effect is getting that white border, right? Or if I put my cursor above this orange, it turns into a darker orange, right? That's a hover effect. Now, what normally happens here is that the change is immediate. You know what I mean? So like here, I'm going to just do something from scratch. Oh, I forgot that you can turn stuff in. Wow, we'll go back. I forgot to mention that you can actually use transform in a 3D dimension. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this cat. You can rotate Y, rotate X, rotate Z. So for instance, I'm going to take the picture of a cat, which has an ID of cat. The way it works, is with 3D, if you rotate X, you rotate towards the camera. If you rotate Y, you rotate kind of like this. I call it the carousel. And if you rotate Z, it rotates towards the camera the way a normal rotation works. So I'm going to do cat, and I'm going to rotate it along the X. So this is like how, if I had an image This is how normally it would rotate. If I rotated X, it's going to rotate like towards or away from the camera. All right. So if I were to do cat transform rotate X, and then I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. Did I do that correctly? Oh, I think that's it. What happened was at 90, it was like this. You couldn't see it. So it was like, this is 90, this is 180. So this is like 45. So it's kind of like this. I can also rotate it in the Y direction. So if I were to rotate it Y 45 degrees, it's kind of hard to tell. It kind of looks like it's smushing it, but what's really happening is it's doing like this. Okay. Sorry, going back to hover effects, I'm going to do a hover effect real quick so you guys can get a sense of it. So let's say I had a button. All right, there's my button. And I'm just going to make it really large, just using some padding. Oops. Um, Something like that. All right. And I'm just going to give it a background color of yellow. And you guys know, hopefully by now, that we can do a hover effect, right? Hover means if my cursor goes above something. So what I could do is I could do button hover background color purple. And I get something like that, right? Now, the thing about this is that this is very stark because you're literally jumping from yellow to purple, which are actually on the opposite sides of the color spectrum. So it's this big jump, right? Sometimes we don't necessarily want that jump from one thing to the other with these hover effects. So we can do something called a transition. What does a transition mean? What it means is rather than just jumping from one value to the next value, it's going to interpolate between the two. In other words, if I'm going from yellow to purple, what would happen is it would go from yellow to orange to red to purple. Okay, it wouldn't just jump from this to this. So in other words, the transition is a little more subtle. It's, it's a little bit animated. It's not as like stark. So I just want to show you some examples of this that I found online. So for instance, let's go here. This is Netflix's homepage, right? And watch what happens when I put my cursor. So, like the normal color for their button is red, right? And then I put my cursor above it and see how it doesn't just jump to that darker maroon color. It kind of fades in. You guys kind of see that it's subtle, but you can kind of see it, right? Same thing actually with this one where it kind of like fades in a little bit. And then actually when I take my cursor away, it fades back to the normal color. That's a transition. Okay. It's subtle. It's not like, but it is a way to kind of see it. This is Coca-Cola. This is you see how it's like fading in, fading out for these buttons over here. Actually, what I was trying to show you was this. See how it kind of like moves the background a little bit. And then when I take my cursor away, it shrinks. You guys see that? All right. So this is what we call a transition. Okay. Now we can do this. It's actually really not that hard. Okay. Let me show you the code we would use. The way it works to do a transition is you basically simply need a normal state, and then you need a hover state. Okay. The hover is the thing that you want to transition. So in other words, like here, I have a yellow background, and when I put my cursor above it, I want to go to a red background. Okay. That's the thing that's changing. Then what we can do is use a property called transition, tell the browser what property we're affecting in terms of the transition, and then how long should that transition take. Okay. It's kind of hard to explain. I think it works better if I actually do it. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to go to exercise 6. Okay. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this let's look at this page right here. I have some text, a paragraph, we got an image. Let's preview this into a browser. Okay. Just going to make it a little bigger. What I'm going to do is let's make this color of the H1, let's make it red. Okay. Boom. Okay. You guys should know how to do that. And then what I'm going to do is let's do a hover. Oops. And let's make it purple. All right. So what's going to happen is if I put my cursor here, it goes from red to purple. And then when I take my cursor back, it goes back to the normal state, right? What I can do is I'm going to add another property. You always apply it to the normal state, which is transition. Now, what is the property that I'm actually affecting? Well, the property I'm affecting is the color property. And then I have to say, how long do I want the transition from this value to this value to take? Typically, we measure it in seconds, okay? So if I were to say 2s, s in this case stands for seconds. So what this is really saying is, okay, this is the normal state of the red, of the H1, it's red. When someone puts their cursor over it, it should transition to the purple value over 2 seconds. Okay, so let's see how that would look. See, it's a little more subtle, and then I take my cursor and it fades back. If you want to make it shorter, or the transition to happen longer, then just lower this value, like 1 second as opposed to 2. Let me refresh, and you can see it happens much quicker. You want it longer, I don't know, let's make it 5 seconds. So it's doing it, it's just more taking longer now. It's much more subtle. Okay. Here's where I'm going to actually use some of that scale, the transform properties we just talked about. Let's say I have this image here, this puppy. Okay. I'm just going to use the IMG tag. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say transform, and let's just use the scale value. Remember, scale is how large the image is. And I'm going to set scale to 1. Okay. Which is actually the default size of the image anyway. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a hover and say, when someone puts their cursor over the image, let's make it scale to be twice its normal size. Okay. So transform scale 1 for the normal state, transform scale 2 or twice the normal size in the hover state. Okay. So if I come into here, cursor gets bigger. Now it jumps from this to this, which is kind of a little unnerving. So what we could do is come back and say, okay, well, how about a transition? So what am I affecting here? Well, what I'm affecting is actually the transform value. So say transform, and then how long should it take to scale? I don't know, 2 seconds maybe? Play around with timing, but. So this is actually what's happening here. It's just, I made it more intense than what they got, but it's the same concept. You know what I mean? Instead of doing scale, what if we did rotation? So I'm going to do rotate. Let's set it to 0 degrees. And then I'm going to set the hover to rotate of 180 degrees. And so what I'm doing here is when I put my cursor above the image, it's actually going to rotate. And then when I take my cursor off, it should rotate back. All right, so you can see how you can do some interesting, fun things with it. I'm going to take this div here and I'm going to give it a background color of yellow. Oops. Do a background color of yellow. And let's do a hover state. And I'll set that background color to purple. All right. Normal, hover, normal, hover. And then what I'm going to do, let's transition that. Transition. What property are we affecting? The background color. And how long should it take? I don't know, 4 seconds. All right. So you can see how we could do some fun stuff here. So in the last example, exercise 6, I was only really animating one property, like, color or transform or background, but you can actually affect multiple properties. So here's what I'm going to do. I have this div and I've changed the width and the height. Okay. So here's my div, here's the normal, and then this is the hover state. Okay. Let's say when I put my cursor above it, I want to change the width property and the height property. So what I'm going to do is say transition. And then what I could say is the name of the property, like width, and then how long should it take? Maybe like, I don't know, 2 seconds. Okay. So you can see the width changing. Now it's not changing the height. The height is jumping because I haven't affected that property. I've only affected the width. So that one's transitioning smoothly. This one's kind of jumping. So what I could do is come into here and I could say, well, height. How long should the height property take? I don't know. Let's make it really fast. So 1 second. So they don't even have to go with the same value. See what I'm doing here? Let's maybe add a third value. Maybe the background color changes to purple. Maybe that one takes, I don't know, 5 seconds. All right. If you want to just animate all of the properties at once with, one line of code and you're okay with them all taking the same amount of time, you can also just do all. If I do all and then the time, like, I don't know, 1.5 seconds, this means it's going to do all 3 of these at once, all with the same amount of time. Okay. So you can kind of see how, this goes from black to gray. This goes slightly bigger to slightly smaller. Last thing is, at the moment when we've been doing these transitions, when I hover, it happens immediately. In other words, like as soon as I put my cursor above it, it starts to transition from one property to the other. If you want, what you could do is actually tell it to delay, which means it won't happen immediately. It'll, wait some time. So here in exercise 8, I have this div, and I've set up dimensions for it, and I've set up a background color for it with a hover effect. It looks like this. Now, I could do a transition, which would be like, let's do transition, background color, I don't know, 2 seconds. Now, what's going to happen is that's going to start as soon as I put my cursor over this. But maybe I don't want it to happen immediately. Maybe I just want it, I put my cursor on and then it pauses for a couple seconds and then starts. Well, what we could do is do transition delay. And I'm going to say 5 seconds. Okay. So what this means is that as soon as I put my cursor above it, it's going to wait 5 seconds and then start to do the transition. Sorry, I had some issues there. Make sure your delay is after your transition, I believe. That fixed my problem here. So it's the same thing. It's just so or either that or I didn't refresh my browser enough. So now what's going to happen is I put my cursor, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi, and then there you go. Now it transitions. Okay. So if you don't, same thing, if I pull it away, it's going to wait a couple of seconds, about 5 seconds, and then transition back. Okay. So you can see how you might want to use this to make a little bit more of a subtle hover effect. You see this a lot with buttons, with background colors, or, making some very slight movements. Here's something you could kind of do in relationship to using the what's the word I'm looking for? The translate. So for instance, let's just say for the sake of argument, I had this H1. I'll just say sample text. Let's do H1 hover. So what I could do is maybe by default, the text is like a little bit off the page, and then I put my cursor, it comes out a little bit. So let's do transform, translate, defaultly 0, but then on the hover, I don't know, nothing too much, maybe like 50 pixels. That's the hover, transition. 1 second. Do you ever see little buttons kind of move forward and backwards, things like that? This is kind of how you can do that pretty quickly. Let's do like a half second. All right. All right, in the next video, I will teach you guys how we can actually use CSS to animate things on our page. Okay?